20,000 French elites charged, but never made it back. Mud, Arrows Massacre. Agincourt 1415. The day knights died in the dirt. In the autumn of 1415, Europe was deep in the long turmoil of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had already raged for nearly 8 decades between England and France. King Henry V of England, only 29 years old, sought to assert his claim to the French crown through a bold campaign across the Channel. Early that year, he had launched an invasion, landing at the mouth of the Seine with the aim of pressuring France into accepting English demands. The first stage of the campaign focused on the fortified port of Harfleur. Henry's forces, estimated at around 12,000 at the outset, laid siege to the town for over a month. The operation ended in victory on the 22nd of September, but at a heavy cost. Continuous rain, poor sanitation, and outbreaks of dysentery ravaged the English army. Hundreds of soldiers died, and many more were left weakened or unfit for further action. With the campaigning season waning and supplies running low, Henry abandoned plans for a deeper advance into Normandy. Determined to demonstrate resolve, and Idery abandoned plans for a deeper advance into Normandy. Determined to demonstrate resolve and assume to resolve and maintain the morale of his troops, Henry decided to march the remainder of his army, perhaps 9,000 men, northward to the English stronghold of Calais. It was a calculated move to show strength while retreating to safety. The route, however, carried great risk. French forces were mobilizing to block his passage, assembling a far larger army drawn from noble families and regional levies across the kingdom. As the English column moved slowly through the wet, cold countryside of northern France, the French high command tightened its net. Their plan was to intercept Henry before he reached the security of Calais and force a decisive battle. Skirmishes and harassment by French scouts reminded the weary English soldiers that a confrontation was inevitable. By late October, the French army, outnumbering the English by more than 2 to 1, was converging on a narrow, muddy stretch of farmland near the village of Agincourt. The stage was set. What began as a demonstration of English resolve had become an unavoidable trial of strength. The fate of Henry's campaign, and perhaps the balance of power between two rival kingdoms, now rested on a sodden field in northern France. By the early hours of the 25th of October 1415, the contrast between the two armies at Agincourt could not have been sharper. King Henry V commanded a force that modern historians estimate at roughly 6,000 to 9,000 men. The core of his army consisted of longbow archers, each armed with the powerful English longbow capable of sending an arrow more than 200 meters with deadly accuracy. Alongside them stood a smaller contingent of men-at-arms knights and professional soldiers who would fight on foot. Many of these English troops were exhausted after weeks of marching in cold rain, their clothing damp and their rations nearly gone. Yet discipline held firm, and their defensive preparations were methodical. Facing them was a much larger French host, often estimated between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers, drawn from the nobility of France and their retinues. The French order of battle reflected the chivalric traditions of the age. Thousands of heavily armored knights on horseback or on foot, supported by crossbowmen and militia. Confidence ran high. Sheer numbers seemed to promise an overwhelming victory and a decisive end to the English incursion. The terrain of Agincourt, however, favored neither grandeur nor cavalry charges. The chosen battlefield was a narrow strip of farmland, roughly 700 yards wide, hemmed in by the dense Tramecourt and Agincourt woods on either side. Heavy rain the night before had turned the freshly plowed soil into deep, sticky mud. For mounted knights in armor weighing up to 30 kilograms, the ground was a trap. Hooves and ironclad feet would sink and slide with each step. Henry recognized the opportunity. He placed his archers in a broad, shallow V formation, protecting their flanks with sharpened wooden stakes angled toward the enemy to repel cavalry. The men-at-arms held the center, ready to absorb an assault. By contrast, The French plan relied on massed charges through the bottleneck, a tactic that would squeeze their large army into the confined corridor and negate its numerical advantage. Thus, on the mist-covered morning of St. Crispin's Day, the two forces stood poised on opposite ends of a muddy field, one smaller, disciplined, and expertly positioned, the other larger, resplendent in armor, but constrained by the very ground beneath their feet. Dawn broke cold and gray over the fields near Agincourt on the 25th of October 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. A damp mist clung to the churned earth, and the sodden ground exhaled the smell of wet soil and trampled crops. Both armies stirred to the sound of horns and shouted commands, each side aware that the coming clash could decide the fate of the campaign on the English side. King Henry V moved among his men on horseback, speaking calmly to archers and men-at-arms alike. Contemporary chronicles note his deliberate effort to steady their spirits after weeks of fatigue and hunger. He ordered his longbowmen to drive sharpened wooden stakes known as palings into the ground at an outward angle to deter cavalry charges. The archers formed a broad, shallow arc, while heavily armed men-at-arms held the center behind them, ready to meet any breakthrough. Henry's plan emphasized defense, discipline, and the deadly range of the longbow across the muddy field. The French commanders, Constable Charles d'Albret, and a host of high-ranking nobles assembled a far grander force. They divided their army into three main lines, each packed with armored knights and dismounted men-at-arms. Cavalry units prepared to sweep around the flanks, and crossbowmen were stationed behind the main formations. Confidence was high, outnumbering the English more than 2-1. The French anticipated a swift victory that would capture Henry himself. Yet as morning stretched toward midday, delays and disagreements plagued the French camp. Arguments arose over leadership and the order of attack. The narrow field, slick with mud, forced the densely packed troops to wait in confined ranks, horses stamping impatiently in the mire. Rain from the previous night continued to soften the soil, turning every step into a slog. Henry used the lull to his advantage. He quietly advanced his front line several dozen yards to seize a slightly higher patch of ground, then ordered his archers to notch arrows and hold steady. The English army, though smaller and weary, stood prepared behind a wall of stakes and silent discipline. By late morning, the mist began to lift, revealing two vast arrays of men glaring across a no-man's land of sticky clay. Drums and banners stirred in the cold breeze. With every passing minute, the tension sharpened. The English poised to unleash a storm of arrows, the French determined to crush them with sheer weight of arms. The field at Agincourt was ready to erupt into one of the most famous battles of the 100 Years' War. Shortly before noon on the 25th of October 1415, silence settled across the narrow field between the two armies. The mist had thinned, revealing long lines of armored men glinting dully in the pale light. For a time, neither side moved. The French, confident in their overwhelming numbers, waited for the English to tire or retreat. Henry V, seeing no advantage in delay, made the first decisive move. The English king ordered his line forward several dozen paces to close the distance and bring the French within the most lethal range of the longbow. At his signal, thousands of archers drove their sharpened stakes deeper into the mud, planted their feet, and raised their bows. A moment later, Henry's clear command rang out. The first volley of arrows erupted with a collective snap of bowstrings, an immense, almost physical sound. Contemporary chroniclers describe the sky darkening as tens of thousands of shafts arced upward, the feathered ends vanishing against the gray clouds before plunging down in a deadly rain. The storm of missiles hissed as it fell, striking armor, shields, and horses with piercing force. French cavalry on the flanks surged forward but quickly faltered. Horses, already restless in the mud, panicked as arrows thudded into their hides or glanced off steel barding. Riders struggled to maintain formation as mounts reared or collapsed. Those who pressed on crashed into the forest of angled stakes, breaking momentum and throwing men to the ground. The dismounted men-at-arms in the French vanguard fared little better. Arrows found the joints of plate armor and the unprotected gaps at visor slits and armpits. Even when the shafts failed to pierce, the sheer impact could stagger a knight or drive him to his knees. The churned, rain-soaked earth turned slick under the weight of advancing troops. Compounding confusion. Volley followed volley. English archers, trained to loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, maintained a relentless rhythm. The sound of bowstrings became a continuous hum, each wave of arrows sowing fresh panic. Horses screamed, men shouted prayers or curses, and the mud grew darker with blood. Within minutes, the opening assault had achieved its purpose. The French front ranks were disordered and slowing, their cavalry charge blunted before it could properly begin. Henry's smaller army, anchored behind its wall of stakes, had drawn first blood and seized the initiative, proving the deadly efficiency of the longbow against even the most heavily armored foe. As the first storm of arrows tore through their ranks, the French vanguard pressed forward, determined to close the distance and bring their superior numbers to bear. But the very ground beneath them became their most formidable enemy. The battlefield at Agincourt was a narrow strip of recently plowed farmland, boxed in by two woods and soaked by days of autumn rain. Under the weight of thousands of armored men and horses, the soil turned into a viscous slurry. Every step drove boots and hooves deeper into the muck, and each fallen soldier or mount churned the ground to an even thicker paste. The heavily armored French knights, burdened with steel plate that could weigh up to 30 kilograms, struggled to maintain momentum. Those in the front ranks sank to their ankles, then their knees, straining to lift one foot after another. Men slipped, collided, and fell, creating obstacles for those behind. The vanguard compressed as the following lines pushed forward, leaving the soldiers with barely enough room to swing their weapons or raise their shields. English longbowmen, seizing the advantage, continued their merciless volleys. Arrows clattered against armor, struck exposed joints, and felled horses, further blocking the advance. Knights who fell into the mud often could not rise unaided. Some suffocated where they lay, crushed beneath the press of their own comrades. The narrow field funneled the massive French force into a dense mass, a single heaving target for the English archers. As the leading French men-at-arms finally reached the English line, they were already exhausted, their strength sapped by the relentless slog through the mire. Henry's men-at-arms and archers, lightly armored and far more mobile, stepped forward with swords, axes, and mallets to meet them. What should have been a thunderous charge had become a slow, grinding crawl into chaos. The mud of Agincourt was no passive backdrop. It was an active weapon. Each minute of combat made the ground more treacherous. Each fallen knight deepened the quagmire. The flower of French chivalry, princes, counts, and seasoned warriors found themselves trapped and vulnerable, their vaunted cavalry advantage nullified. In the cold, wet fields of northern France, the weight of their own armor and the unyielding earth conspired with English arrows to turn the advance into a deadly, suffocating mire. By the time the leading French men-at-arms finally staggered into striking distance of the English line, they were exhausted from the relentless arrow fire and the punishing march through the mire. Their armor, once a source of pride and protection, now dragged at their limbs like an anchor. Instead of the swift, crushing charge envisioned by their commanders, the assault arrived as a slow, heaving mass of weary fighters. King Henry V had ordered his men-at-arms, English knights and seasoned infantry, to hold firm in the center, shields locked and weapons ready. Behind them, the longbowmen, having loosed thousands of arrows, laid down their bows and rushed forward with maces, hatchets, and short swords. Lightly armored and nimble after years of training, these archers proved deadly in hand-to-hand combat. The clash was brutal. The narrow front forced the French into a tight press where sword strokes had little room to swing. Many knights could only thrust awkwardly, their movements hampered by heavy plate and the sucking mud. English fighters used the advantage, striking at visors, armpits, and joints with daggers and mallets designed to pierce or crush armor. Knights who fell were in mortal danger. The crush of bodies behind them left no space to rise. Some were trampled or slowly suffocated beneath their own allies. Chroniclers recorded that piles of dead and wounded soon created makeshift barricades, further choking the advance of those still struggling forward. Henry himself fought on the front line, identifiable by the crown built into his helmet. According to eyewitness accounts, he narrowly avoided death when a blow from a French axe shattered part of his crown and dented his helm. His presence inspired the English soldiers to maintain their formation despite the chaos. The 2nd and 3rd French divisions attempted to reinforce the fight, but the bottlenecked field and mounting casualties turned each fresh push into another blood-soaked stalemate. English archers darted in and out, stabbing with knives or striking with clubs, while men-at-arms methodically cut down opponents trapped in the mud dot within hours. The strength of the French assault collapsed. What had begun as a confident advance by the flower of French nobility had disintegrated into a desperate melee where mud, exhaustion, and English discipline decided the outcome. The field of Agincourt was now littered with shattered weapons, broken armor, and the bodies of countless knights. The air thick with the iron scent of blood and the cries of the wounded dot as the sun dipped low on 25 October 1415. The battlefield of Agincourt fell eerily quiet. The cries of the wounded mingled with the groans of men struggling in the mud, but the clash of steel had ceased. King Henry V's smaller, exhausted army had achieved a victory few in Europe would have thought possible that morning. Contemporary estimates suggest that over 6,000 French soldiers were killed, among them some of the highest nobility of the realm, dukes, counts, and experienced commanders who formed the backbone of France's chivalric elite. Hundreds more, including prominent nobles such as Charles, Duke of Orleans, were captured and held for ransom. By contrast, English losses were remarkably light, with most chronicles recording 500 dead, many of them archers who had fought in the close melee. Henry V faced a sudden crisis late in the day when a small French cavalry force threatened the English baggage train in the rear. Fearing a renewed assault and unable to guard so many high-ranking prisoners, Henry ordered the controversial execution of a large number of captives to prevent them from regrouping. Though criticized by some chroniclers, the decision underscored the precariousness of the English position, even in victory. With the field secured, Henry's weary troops set about gathering the wounded and salvaging equipment amid the thick, bloodied mud. French banners lay trampled, their brilliant colors dulled by rain and earth. The once proud flower of French knighthood lay scattered across the narrow strip of farmland, their costly armor offering no protection against the combination of mud, discipline, and the deadly English longbow. The victory at Agincourt resonated far beyond that cold October day. It strengthened Henry's claim to the French throne and paved the way for the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized him as heir to King Charles VI of France. More immediately, it electrified England. News of the triumph spread quickly across the Channel, celebrated in churches and marketplaces as a sign of divine favor. Agincourt also carried lasting military significance. The battle demonstrated that well-trained infantry and ranged weapons could shatter the supremacy of heavy cavalry, a lesson that would influence European warfare for generations. For Henry V, it was a defining moment, a combination of strategy, discipline, and sheer resilience that turned a desperate retreat into one of the most celebrated victories of the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Agincourt stands as one of the most striking examples of how strategy, terrain, and technology can outweigh sheer numbers. Against overwhelming odds, King Henry V's disciplined army used every available advantage: the range and rate of fire of the English longbow, the defensive stakes that blunted cavalry charges, and the treacherous mud that turned the heavy armor of the French knights into a liability. Historians view the victory not as a triumph of chance, but as the product of careful preparation and relentless discipline. Henry's decision to position his troops on narrow ground, his insistence on steady formations, and the professionalism of his longbowmen proved decisive. The French command, by contrast, suffered from overconfidence and poor coordination. Their massed advance into a constricted, rain-soaked field created exactly the conditions that magnified English strengths. Agincourt's impact extended far beyond the immediate campaign. Politically, the victory enabled Henry V to negotiate the Treaty of Triel in 1420, which recognized him as heir to the French throne and temporarily united the crowns of England and France. Militarily, the battle symbolized the waning era of the mounted knight. It demonstrated that well-trained infantry armed with powerful ranged weapons could overcome the traditional dominance of heavily armored cavalry, a lesson that reshaped European warfare in the 15th century and beyond. Culturally, Agincourt became embedded in English national identity. Chroniclers celebrated it as proof of divine favor, and later writers, most famously William Shakespeare and Henry V, turned the battle into an enduring narrative of courage and unity against overwhelming odds. From a modern perspective, Agincourt illustrates timeless principles of conflict, logistics, adaptability, and the intelligent use of environment often outweigh mere numerical superiority. The muddy field of northern France, combined with human ingenuity and discipline, transformed a desperate defensive action into a legendary victory, one that still resonates as a testament to strategy over brute force. The Battle of Agincourt did far more than decide a single campaign in the 100 Years' War. Its consequences rippled across Europe and influenced the evolution of warfare, politics, and national identity for centuries to come. Agincourt demonstrated with stark clarity that discipline, terrain, and ranged firepower could defeat heavy cavalry, the elite force of medieval Europe. The English longbow, wielded by trained archers, inflicted catastrophic losses on armored knights who for generations had dominated the battlefield. This lesson resonated well beyond England and France. Across the continent, military planners began to invest more heavily in infantry tactics, projectile weapons, and professional armies rather than relying solely on noble cavalry. The gradual decline of the traditional knightly charge and the rise of massed infantry and artillery can be traced in part to the precedent set at Agincourt. Henry V's triumph transformed the political landscape of the 100 Years' War. The victory paved the way for the Treaty of Triel in 1420, which recognized him as heir to the French throne and effectively placed much of France under English influence. Although England's hold on France eventually faded, the treaty and the victory that made it possible altered the balance of power for a generation and delayed France's eventual resurgence. For England, Agincourt became a defining national myth. Chroniclers portrayed the win as proof of divine favor and the resilience of the English spirit. Centuries later, William Shakespeare immortalized the battle in Henry V, ensuring that the imagery of a small, steadfast army overcoming impossible odds remained central to English cultural memory. Phrases such as the Band of Brothers, drawn from Shakespeare's account, continue to symbolize unity and courage that the lessons of Agincourt echoed far beyond Europe's medieval wars. Military strategists in later eras, from early modern commanders experimenting with firearms to modern officers studying asymmetric warfare, have cited Agincourt as evidence that technology, environment, and discipline can outweigh numerical superiority. The principle that a well-prepared, strategically positioned force can overcome a larger opponent remains relevant in military academies worldwide. The muddy field near the village of Agincourt thus shaped not only the course of the 100 Years' War but also the trajectory of global military thinking. Agincourt's enduring significance lies in how it revealed the limits of tradition and the power of adaptation, lessons that continue to resonate far beyond the cold, rain-soaked morning of the 25th of October 1415.